In the summer of 1944, a German general stared at his reconnaissance maps and felt something cold creep down his spine. His scouts had reported an entire American armored division positioned north of the Moselle River. Dozens of tanks, hundreds of vehicles, radio traffic buzzing night and day. The threat was real. The danger was clear, and he redirected 3 full Wehrmacht divisions to intercept it. There was only one problem. Every single one of those tanks was made of rubber. The men behind this deception were not special forces operators. They were not hardened veterans who had clawed their way up their ranks. They were painters, set designers, sound engineers, and advertising copywriters. They were the kind of young American men who before the war had spent their evenings at jazz clubs in New York City and argued about Picasso over cheap coffee. They were in the most literal sense artists at Warrant. They pulled off one of the most audacious campaigns of psychological warfare in the entire history of the Second World War. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the unit so classified that its very existence remained secret for 50 years after the guns fell silent. The unit so bizarre, so improbable, so genuinely American in its ingenuity and irreverence that when the Germans finally began piecing together what had happened to them, their intelligence officers reportedly refused to believe it. A Wehrmacht analyst reviewing capture documents after the war wrote in his assessment, "The scale of the deception was something we simply had not conceived as possible. We looked for a sophisticated apparatus. However, what we found was closer to a traveling theater company." A traveling theater company, that description is both insulting and completely accurate, and it captures everything you need to understand about what made these men so extraordinarily dangerous. They called themselves the Ghost Army, and by the time Germany surrendered, they had run over 20 distinct deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Germany, and Belgium. Each one a carefully staged performance designed to make enemy commanders see what was never there, fear what could not hurt them, and ignore what was about to destroy them. The story does not begin in combat. It begins in an office building in Washington in the spring of 1943, where a handful of army planners faced a problem that had no obvious solution. The Americans and British had learned through painful experience in North Africa that fooling an enemy required more than one trick. Radio silence was not enough. Dummy equipment was not enough. Then, you needed to deceive multiple enemy intelligence systems simultaneously, each one reinforcing the others, creating a coherent false picture that no single analyst could easily dismantle. And what the planners assembled was, on paper, a headquarters unit. In practice, it was something that had never existed before in military history. 4 separate elements, each targeting a different layer of enemy intelligence, designed to work in concert like instruments in an orchestra. The first element was visual deception. Inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, each manufactured to precise scale and capable of fooling aerial reconnaissance photography. When deployed correctly, with appropriate track marks in the mood and half-hearted camouflage netting draped over their tops, these rubber ghosts were nearly indistinguishable from the real thing at altitude. The men who set them up and took them down were called the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. Most of them had backgrounds in stagecraft and industrial design. The second element was sonic deception. A unit called the Signal Company Special had developed a system of high-powered speakers mounted on half-tracks capable of projecting recorded battlefield sounds across distances of up to 15 miles. They had libraries of sound effects recorded at Aberdeen Proving Ground, tank columns moving up, engineering units building bridges, artillery batteries preparing to fire. At the right moment, on the right night, those half-tracks would park in the tree and fill the darkness with the sounds of an army that did not exist. German infantry crouching in their positions and listening to the rumble and clank growing louder in the dark, had no reason to doubt what the ears were telling them. The third element was tactical deception. Small teams wearing the insignia and driving the vehicles of whatever real unit the Ghost Army was impersonating, moving through French and Belgian towns in deliberate view of civilians, speaking loudly in cafes, leaving carefully fabricated documents in conspicuous places, planting the right false information in the poorest social fabric of liberated cities where German agents were still operating. The fourth element was the most elegant of all, conceptualized radio unit, manned by operators who had spent months studying the individual transmission styles, the personal quirks, the specific rhythms of the radio operators in real American divisions. Because every operator develops habits over time, a particular way of keying Morse code, a characteristic pause between letters, a signature flourish, that experienced listeners learn to recognize the way you recognize a friend's handwriting. The German Signals Intelligence Service, the Funkhof-Klarong, was extraordinarily good at this kind of analysis. They could often identify specific American divisions just from the patterns of their radio traffic, even without breaking the code. The Ghost Army's radio operators studied and mimicked those patterns with the precision of jazz musicians learning another player's style. When a real division went silent before an operation, the Ghost Army's ops operators stepped in and kept the traffic flowing, making sure that what the Germans heard on the airwaves matched what they saw through their reconnaissance lenses. Together, these four elements could create something that no single technique could accomplish alone. They could create errality, a false one, yes, but internally consistent, independently verifiable from multiple intelligence channels, and therefore genuinely convincing to trained enemy professionals whose entire job was to see through exactly this kind of thing. The men themselves were, by any conventional military standard, an absurdity. The unit had been assembled in a way that defied normal army logic. Rather than drawing from the infantry pool, the recruiters had gone looking for artists. Actual artists, the fine art programs at prestigious American schools, the illustration departments of major advertising agencies, the set design studios of Broadway theaters, and Hollywood production companies. They had recruited from the Art Students League of New York, from the Philadelphia Museum School of Art, from the Rhode Island School of Design. Among the men who eventually served in the 23rd were Bill Blass, who would become one of the most celebrated fashion designers in American history, Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of the defining abstract painters of the 20th century, Arthur Singer, the naturalist illustrator. These were not men who had grown up firing rifles. They were men who had grown up arguing about light, composition, narrative, and the mechanics of creating illusion. They were, it turned out, exactly the right men for the job. Their commanding officer, Colonel Harry Rear, understood from the beginning that the unit's unconventional nature required an unconventional approach. He gave his men more latitude than almost any other American unit in the European theater. Their camps, when they were in rest areas, sometimes looked more like outdoor art studios than military installations. French civilians passing by would stop and stare at the sight of American soldiers, carefully watercoaling the Norman countryside between operations. This was not an accident. Rear understood that creative people needed space to think, that the psychological flexibility required to design convincing deceptions was the same flexibility that required a certain freedom from rigid routine. He managed the tension between military discipline and creative license with considerable skill, and the result was a unit genuinely unlike anything the American army had ever fielded. The Germans had no category for them. That was ultimately the entire point. The Ghost Army arrived in France in late May of 1944 and spent the first months doing what no unit had ever had to do before, learning how to be an army they were erot. Their first assignment was to impersonate the 2nd Armored Division, one of the most powerful American units in the European theater. Hell on Wheels had a formidable reputation built over campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. German intelligence had extensive files on its order of battle, its commanders, its radio signature, and its tactical tendencies. The Ghost Army had to become that division so convincingly that German observers, analysts, and listening posts would have no reason to doubt what they were seeing and hearing. They studied the 2nd Armor's demarcation obsessively. There painted their vehicles with the division's markings. Their radio operators learned the transmission styles of their counterparts in the real division. Their camouflage engineers inflated dozens of rubber Shermans and positioned them in formations that matched the real division's tactical doctrine. And then the tactical deception teams drove into the nearest French towns and became soldiers of the 2nd Armored in every observable way. They wore the shoulder patch. They drank in local bars and let themselves be seen. They left carefully engineered paperwork in places where it would be found by people who might pass information to German networks still operating in France. The operation worked. German units redirected. Their L-2nd Armored moved through what had been a covered flank. American commanders who knew about the deception watched enemy dispositions shift in exactly the pattern the 23rd's performance was designed to produce. For the Ghost Army, their first success established a template they would refine and deploy more than 20 times over the following year. By the autumn of 1944, the performances had become genuinely theatrical in their complexity. The sonic warfare unit had expanded its sound libraries and refined its Dimblin techniques. The radio operators had developed a fluency in their impersonations that went beyond mimicry into mastery. Camouflage engineers had learned which visual details were most legible from altitude, which angles of photography would show their inflatable equipment to best advantage. One of the most operationally significant moments came in late November during the fighting along the Moselle River. The 12th Army Group was attempting to maintain pressure along a broad front while concentrating force for a breakthrough attempt. The Ghost Army was tasked with creating the illusion of an entire division holding a sector that was actually screened by only a handful of real troops. The sonic units moved into the terrain after dark. The inflatable tank park was constructed in a valley visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. The radio operators flooded the appropriate frequencies with traffic consistent with a full divisional headquarters in active operations. The tactical deception teams moved through the nearest town with the conspicuous casualness of men who belonged exactly where they appeared to. A German prisoner taken in Easter 3 days later during initial interrogations described what his unit had observed. He had heard tank engines and heavy vehicle movement in the darkness. His commanders had received reports of American armored forces massing north of their position. They had pulled back to a more defensible line. The American units they were pulling back to avoid did not exist. The interrogating officer noted the subject appeared genuinely confused by their discrepancy between intelligence reports and ground reality. He remains convinced that a significant American armored force was operating in the sector. He is correct that this is what his unit observed. He is incorrect about what produced those observations. That gap between what the Germans observed and what had actually produced those observations was the Ghost Army's entire existence. The deception operations carried genuine danger. The men of the 23rd were not, for the most part, combat soldiers. The sonic units and the camouflage engineers often worked close enough to German lines that a patrol or an artillery barrage could have found them with catastrophic results. Then they had to be conspicuous enough to be convincing and invisible enough to survive. That balance required a kind of sustained nerve that had nothing to do with conventional battlefield courage and everything to do with the particular anxiety of the performer who knows that the show must go on no matter what is happening backstage. In August of 1944, a tactical deception team operating in a French village found themselves sharing a cave with what turned out to be a pair of German officers in civilian clothes, attempting to pass themselves off as local Frenchmen. The Americans were in the uniforms of a division that was known in the area. The Germans were monitoring the local population for exactly this kind of inconsistency. For approximately 2 hours, both sets of men performed their respective covers with impeccable discipline. Neither side acknowledging what both sides suspected, the Americans left first. They drove to the nearest military police post and reported the encounter. The German officers were apprehended within the hour. The incident illustrated something fundamental about the work the Ghost Army was doing. Deception, at its most sophisticated, is a competition between two performers. The side that breaks character first loses. The Americans, with their theater training and their advertising world comfort with the manufactured image, turned out to have a particular talent for holding character under pressure. They were better actors than their opponents had anticipated. The climax of the Ghost Army's war came in late March of 1945 on the banks of the Rhine River. Operation Versen was the largest and most complex deception the 23rd had ever attempted. The 12th Army Group was preparing to cross the Rhine with 2 real corps. The Ghost Army's assignment was to make the Germans believe that the crossing was coming in an entirely different location, drawing their defensive reserves to the wrong sector. While the real assault went elsewhere, they simulated not one but two full American divisions, the 30th Infantry Division and the 75th Infantry Division, two fully equipped fighting forces that existed in reality only as rubber, recorded sound, radio attic, and the carefully practiced performance of young American artists wearing someone else's insignia. For 5 days they ran the complete production, inflatable artillery, pieces, positioned to suggest pre-crossing bombardment preparation, sonic units broadcasting the sounds of bridging equipment being assembled, radio traffic consistent with the headquarters of two active divisions in final attack preparation. Tactical teams moving through every town in the sector. With the patches and manner of men, we were hours away from crossing a major river. Then, the German 89th Corps, positioned opposite what they believed was the primary crossing site, reinforced their defensive positions. They brought up reserves. They concentrated their artillery to respond to what they were certain was the imminent assault. The assault never came. Not there. The real crossings went in 12 miles to the north. They found defenses that had been stripped to reinforce the sector that was watching rubber tanks inflate in the dark. A German officer captured during the aftermath was interrogated by American intelligence. Then, he described the intelligence picture his headquarters had assembled, the photographic reconnaissance showing the armor concentration, the radio intercepts confirming divisional level command and control, the civilian reports of American soldiers everywhere, the sonic intelligence from listening posts recording unmistakable pre-crossing preparations. Everything told us the crossing was coming there, he told his interrogators. Everything said. There was no single piece of evidence that contradicted the picture. When the Americans crossed to the north, we could not understand it. Our intelligence had not failed. Everything we received was accurate. Simply did not know that accuracy itself could be fabricated. Accuracy itself could be fabricated. The German officer had, in his confusion, produced the most precise possible description of what the Ghost Army had accomplished. They had not given the Germans false information. They had given them an entirely false reality, complete, internally consistent, and verifiable through every available intelligence channel. Ferreting. Military historians who have studied the unit's operations estimate that over the course of its deception campaign, the Ghost Army may have been responsible for preventing anywhere from 30,000 to 40,000 American casualties. Those numbers are estimates. They will never be precise, because you cannot count the battles that did not happen, the ambushes that were never prepared, the defensive lines that were never reinforced in the right place. The Ghost Army's victories were defined by absence. The attack that did not come, the position that was not under fire, the flank that was not turned. The answer the United States Army chose for 50 years was silence. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was classified when the war ended. The techniques they had developed, the operational framework they had pioneered, all of it was considered too valuable to ongoing Cold War intelligence operations to be disclosed. The men who had served were instructed not to speak about their service. They returned to their civilian lives, to their art studios and advertising agencies and design offices, and they carried their secret with them. Bill Blaskame, one of the most celebrated names in American fashion. He never mentioned that he had spent months impersonating armies that did not exist, deploying rubber tanks in French meadows while German reconnaissance aircraft circled overhead. Ellsworth Kelly returned to New York and became one of the defining figures of American abstract art, his work shown in the world's great museums. He never mentioned that some of his deepest artistic experiences had been watching inflatable equipment rise in a French field. At 3 in the morning, listening to distant artillery that might at any moment be directed at a fiction he had helped construct. They were artists who had made the greatest work of their lives and been forbidden to sign their names to it. The classification was lifted in 1996. The men who were still alive began speaking. They showed their sketches and paintings made in the field, the visual records they had kept, because they were artists, and they could not help recording what they saw. Wehrmacht intelligence analyst, D. One of the post-war assessors tasked with understanding why German intelligence had failed so consistently in specific sectors of the American front wrote in a document eventually declassified alongside the Ghost Army's own records. The Americans demonstrated a form of operational creativity that we had not anticipated and for which we had no adequate counter-doctrine. They understood that intelligence is not a record of reality. It is a construction assembled from multiple sources and filtered through the expectations of the analyst. By feeding those sources simultaneously, they did not deceive our intelligence. They directed it. The result was that our intelligence was always accurate. It simply described a reality that the Americans had built for us to find. That sentence deserves to be read slowly. Our intelligence was always accurate. It simply described a reality that the Americans had built for us to find. Themen of the 23rd had not fooled the German army by feeding it lies. They had fooled it by building a world, a complete, detailed, internally consistent world, in which the German army was making perfectly rational decisions based on perfectly accurate information about perfectly real forces that happened in every essential respect to be made of rubber and recorded sound, and the practiced manner of young American artists wearing someone else's insignia. They had beaten one of the most sophisticated military intelligence services in history. Not with firepower, not with numbers, not with superior technology, but with imagination. In the closing months of the war, several senior Wehrmacht commanders became obsessed with understanding what had happened to them in those sectors, where the Americans seemed always to be where they were not expected, and never where they were expected to be. Their post-war testimonies contain references to Phantom-Einheit, a ghost unit that seemed to appear and disappear at will across the entire front, always one step ahead, always creating confusion where there should have been clarity. They were right that such a unit existed. What they never fully understood, even in retrospect, was that the Phantom Ein was not a group of commandos or intelligence officers. It was a group of young men from Brooklyn and Philadelphia and Chicago who had gone to art school and spent the most important years of their lives learning how to make other people see what they wanted them to see. There is a particular kind of American story that the country tells about itself in wartime. It is usually a story about individual courage, about ordinary men doing extraordinary things under fire. It is a good story. It is often a true story. Story of the Ghost Army as a different kind of American story. It is a story about what happens when you take a country that builds things that, sells things that had developed by 1944, the most sophisticated manufacturing and marketing apparatus in the world, and ask it to turn that apparatus against an enemy that had never understood what it was up against. It is a story about the particular genius of a culture that had spent the preceding decades learning to make people believe in images that were sometimes exactly what they appeared to, and sometimes something considerably more carefully constructed. It is a story about artists who went to war and fought it the only way they knew how. When the classification was finally lifted, one of the veterans was asked by a journalist what the experience had meant to him, what he carried from those years in France and Germany and Belgium doing the strange, improbable dangerous thing they had done. He was an old man by then, and he paused for a long moment before he answered. "We saved lives," he said finally. "That's what I carry. We were artists, we were kids. We had no business being anywhere near a war, but we saved lives. And we did it the only way we could have. We made the enemy believe in something that wasn't there, and they acted on that belief. And because of what they did and didn't do, other American boys went home, wouldn't have gone home otherwise. I carry that." He paused again. "And I carry the rubber tanks. You never quite forget the rubber tanks. The Ghost Army. 2,300 men over 20 operations. One of the greatest deceptions in military history, and for 50 years a secret known only to those who had lived it. Carried quietly through half a century of American life by men who had made the world believe in something that was never there, and Wook knew in whatever private part of themselves they kept that knowledge exactly how much it had been earth.